executive session because many committees are organizing this morning. Senator Tillis is on one of them, and many of our members need to get to other committee rooms. I will withhold my opening statement until today's hearing. This morning, we meet to approve the committee's rules and procedures, budget resolution for this Congress, subcommittee organization, jurisdiction, and an updated committee questionnaire for presidential nominees for the 118th. I want to thank Ranking Member Scott and his cooperation, his staff, Leela, Catherine, Amber, and Chuck. I want to thank my committee staff, Laura, Alicia, and Jeremy, and thanks to our non-designated clerk, Cameron, who was also with Senator Crapo when he was chair, for his work on these documents and his insights drawn from his years of service to this committee. I want to welcome our new members. Senator Vance is here. Welcome from my state of Ohio. I congratulate our subcommittee chairs and ranking members. They have taken their positions and made their selections. Thank everyone for their cooperation at this markup. Ranking Member Scott and I have worked closely together to advocate for our committee's budget with success and have agreed to clarifying updates to our committee's questionnaire for nominees. I appreciate that good start, Tim, on our collaboration. Ranking Member Scott, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much. Let me first start my thoughts and my comments with Senator Fetterman. I think we should take a moment and just pray for his health.
Thank you.
I know that he was hospitalized, and it's important for us to recognize the stress that puts on his family and on himself. So if we could have 5 seconds of silence so we can pray for him. Thank you. Just quick opening comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Brown. I'd like to say I'm starting my lead as a ranking member on the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Development Committee, and it's a blessing to do so without any question. I will say as we are into Black History Month, it's also important to note that the Republican Party continues to provide firsts, as I believe that I am the first ranking member or chairman of the Banking Committee perhaps in its history. And I say that as a proud Republican that all things are possible in this country, and while we see diversity is an important component, we also see that hard work pays off, and I thank my colleagues for your support for making this a possibility. I have the blessing of living my mother's American dream. Without any question, the topic of today will be an important one from Frances Scott's perspective, someone who looked forward to owning her own home for a very long time. It took her nearly 45 years to get there, and thank God she did. I hope that we spend a lot of time talking during this hearing about the importance of home ownership in such a way that it provides hope and reality on what it takes to own your own home, looking at ways to tackle the challenges that so many single mothers face around this country. And to Senator Britt and Senator Vance, thank you both for being a part of this hearing and this committee, and I look forward to your participation and your engagement.
Thanks, Senator Scott. I now move to approve en bloc by voice vote the committee's rules of procedure, our budget resolution for this Congress, the subcommittee organization and jurisdiction, and the updated committee questionnaire. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The resolution adopted. The documents are approved en bloc. The budget resolution is ordered reported. I now ask unanimous consent the staff be allowed to make any technical and conforming changes, and that the Corden rule be waived. Any objection? Hearing no objection, it's so ordered. That concludes our executive session. Thank you to members for being here for this.
Come back soon.
You can stay if you want.
I'm not sure where your binder is.
Thank you. Okay, well, as long as you have the pages, okay. Okay. This is a new session, new rules, new everything. The members, the witnesses, please come to you can see which seat you're in, I assume. So if I get screwed up in my order of pages, I'll be patient with you. Okay.
All the way today, though.
Welcome back to many of you, fewer of you, but thank you for sticking around, Jack and and Mike. I appreciate that. I want to welcome Senator Scott as the new ranking member of this committee. He's played an important role on this committee for nearly a decade. I also want to thank him for his words about Senator Fetterman. We hope he recovers quickly. He's a good man, and he was put on this committee just a couple of weeks ago. Also, Senator Brett, and my colleague from Ohio, Senator Vance. Ranking member Scott and I have worked closely together to advocate for our committee's budget. We've agreed to clarifying updates. I appreciate the work that he has done. Okay, where am I? Okay. I'm pleased especially to have worked with Senator Scott on issues that matter to families across this country, from making sure expecting moms have health care to supporting investment in home revitalization so we can increase home ownership opportunities for all Americans. I look forward to the work we'll do together over the next 2 years. Last Congress, this committee talked more about housing than we had for a long time. Around town, this committee for years had been referred to simply as the Senate Banking Committee. Far too much about Wall Street, not nearly enough about the issues that matter to people's lives: housing, transit, community development, and frankly, small and regional banks and credit unions. We're starting this Congress with a hearing on housing because it's one of the most important issues facing families from Aiken, South Carolina to Zanesville, Ohio. Housing determines so much about your life: how long it takes to get to work, whether you have easy access to a bank or fresh food, whether you worry about your kids getting sick from lead paint or mold. It determines your access and your kids' access to opportunity. And for far too many people, safe, affordable housing, it's just too hard to find. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't hear about the challenges that Ohioans are facing in the housing market. In just the last few weeks, I've heard from Ohio seniors who have lived in the same manufactured housing community for years, sometimes decades, but they're now worried they'll lose their homes after an out-of-state investor bought literally their neighborhood and raised their rents. I've heard from renters in rural Ohio whose rent went up almost 90% in a single year, the same kind of problems that the ranking member has to endure in rural areas in his state. I've heard from city council members and mayors who are excited to have new jobs, bringing economic opportunities for the region, but now they're worried there simply isn't enough housing for new workers, or that existing workers will be priced out, as we've seen happen to teachers and police officers and firefighters. The story's the same nationally. There just isn't enough quality housing at prices people can afford. It's not just happening. It's not happening just in Ohio. Nationwide, we're short an estimated 3.8 million homes, and the gap grows. In Ohio, we're short 50,000 homes. In Senator Scott's home state, it's 12,000. In Senator Sinema's home state, the estimate is 123,000 homes. Because there aren't enough homes, renters and home buyers are stuck paying more every month or living with peeling lead paint or leaks if they can find a home at all. 2021, a record number of renters, 21 million households paid more than 30% of their income for housing, more than 30%. That's about half the nation's renters. Many of these renters work full-time jobs or more than one job, but it just isn't enough. 11 of the 25 most common occupations in the U.S., workers who depend on home health aides, office support staff. Nearly half of the most common occupations don't pay enough to afford a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in the country. More renters are struggling in part because rents have skyrocketed over the past 3 years. Nationwide rents are 25% higher than they were in 2019. Some places rent has gone up even more than that. And while rent growth is finally starting to slow in some places, millions of families are still paying more each month than they would have a year or two ago. That means less money for food. It means less money for childcare. It means less money for prescription drugs. Saving for a down payment is for far too many families just simply an impossibility. Combine sky-high rents with higher home prices, with rising interest rates, with too few homes in the market, home ownership looks further and further out of reach for millions of families. And the families who've already become homeowners are feeling the squeeze too. 1 in 5 homeowners pays more than they can afford. That includes families who have to make tough choices about paying their water bills or their heat or their mortgage, and seniors who have to put off critical repairs to keep up with payments on a fixed income. It's not just a problem in big cities or the Pacific coast or Atlantic coast. It's not just a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It hits every community, rural, suburban, urban, tribal communities, every state in the country. As we heard last Congress, communities from Bozeman, Montana to Tempe, Arizona to Akron, Ohio struggle with the lack of affordable housing. A national problem will take all of us, Senator Scott and I and many others, to work to solve it. Today's witnesses are experts chosen together. Senator Scott's staff and mine worked together. The majority and minority chose these witnesses together. This bipartisan group will help us understand the housing conditions facing renters and homeowners across the country and what we can expect in the months and years ahead. Their insights on the availability and affordability of housing, the barriers to new development of more affordable housing, the unique challenges in rural and tribal communities that Senator Rounds knows so very well in his work with Senator Smith bipartisanly on a number of solutions will inform this committee's work to make housing opportunities available to families in all 50 states. I look forward to hearing from witnesses today, to working with all of my colleagues, including our 3 new members, to find common ground in addressing these challenges. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. That certainly has been a privilege to work with you when we find common ground. I think sometimes common ground typically leads to common sense, and we have found some common ground between the two of us. We also, very often, I believe, see the same problem. We see different paths to get to the solution. Today is a day where we celebrate bipartisanship, and it may not be every day, but it is at least today. And thank you for working together on consensus witnesses to really understand and appreciate the plight of so many Americans who are suffering through the challenges of homeownership or renting. As I said in my earlier comments, I grew up with a mom who worked really hard, 16 hours a day. We rented through high school. We lived with my grandparents when we were younger, with my brother, my mother, and I sharing a bed and a bedroom in a rented house. And so the problems that we see aren't recent problems. They span back through history. You think about where we find ourselves. So today we have an opportunity to really try to understand why housing in this country has become so expensive and out of reach to so many families. Federal housing policies have long been disconnected from the economic realities that we face. Recent spending bills have contributed to what I call housing inflation, and I worry that continuing to promote irresponsible federal spending does not address affordability challenges. In fact, in many ways, it may be the root. Too much money flooding into our market, leading to incredible inflation, and then the Fed tries to figure out how to tamp down inflation by slowing the economy. This administration likes to talk about the need for more affordable housing, but as we all know, talk is cheap and leads to empty promises. For instance, when President Biden ends federal apprenticeship programs that produce high-paying jobs in the skilled trades, he shouldn't get to bemoan the lack of construction workers. Or when he fails to address domestic supply chain bottlenecks, he shouldn't feign surprise when construction materials takes months to arrive at job sites. Threatening builders and housing providers with the possibility of rent control will only further increase the gap in housing supply. For decades, Washington's response to housing challenges has simply been more spending. We need to end this cycle and stop spinning our wheels. While the trillions spent on numerous federal housing programs were well-intended, I don't doubt that, the net result, however, has made no meaningful and lasting impact on home ownership rates, especially as we see burdensome regulations push closing costs higher and higher, making the path to home ownership even more difficult. For African American families in particular, the home ownership rate remains unchanged since 1968. Unchanged, the year the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. For too long, assistance programs have served as subsistence programs for the most vulnerable Americans. It's past time to rethink the tax and spend strategies that keep families trapped in generational cycles of poverty and find real solutions to meaningfully impact households, breaking that cycle of poverty. Government must begin responsibly helping families rather than doubling down on programs that fail to generate modest results. We need to leverage the successes of American capitalism by encouraging private investment in the housing sector and eliminating needless barriers that artificially restrict supply. And most importantly, we should remember that effective housing policy is driven by communities. It is critically important the federal government encourages local solutions to uniquely local problems. These ideas are common sense and shouldn't be controversial. I sincerely believe Republicans and Democrats should be able to find common ground on many of these important matters that impact the American people. I thank Chairman Brown for working together on building this consensus panel, as you said earlier. With that, I would like to welcome the witnesses, and I look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Scott, and thank you for your comments about common ground as we are beginning to find. So thank you for that. I'll introduce the three witnesses. Dr. Christopher Herbert, from left to right, is the Managing Director of the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. He's a lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Design in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. Welcome. Dr. Robert Dietz is Chief Economist, Senior Vice President for Economics and Housing Policy at one of the most important housing organizations in the country, the National Association of Home Builders. Prior to joining them, he worked as an economist for the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation. He's a native of Beaver Creek, Ohio, I believe, a town in southwest Ohio, not far from Dayton, Springfield. Mr. Lance George is Director of Research and Information at the Housing Assistance Council. Mr. George leads the organization's research, data, and information efforts. So welcome, Mr. George. Mr. Herbert, if you would begin your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing. I am Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies of Harvard University, a lecturer in the Department of Urban Planning and Design at the Graduate School of Design. I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of Freddie Mac. Through its research, education, and public outreach programs, the Joint Center for Housing Studies' mission is to advance understanding of housing issues and to help leaders in government, business, and the civic sectors make decisions that effectively address the needs of cities and communities. For more than 3 decades, we have published our annual State of the Nations report, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to share our work with the committee today. Perhaps the most apt description of the housing market trends over the last year is that of a roller coaster ride. First marked by home prices and rents increasing at a dizzying pace in response to pandemic-enhanced demand and against a backdrop of restricted supply, and now in the midst of a dramatic slide in response to the Federal Reserve's efforts to bring inflation under control. While the forces behind these trends are certainly out of the ordinary, they have illuminated and exacerbated housing challenges that are not new, but rather long in the making. Arguably, the nation's principal housing challenge is that of affordability. The share of renters facing housing cost burdens rose from the 2000s through the middle of last decade. While the last few years before the pandemic saw a modest recovery, the cost-burdened share of renters has now worsened substantially in the face of rising rents. While young adults and people of color were able to make up some lost ground in homeowning following the Great Recession, the combination of very high home prices and now much higher interest rates has priced most would-be owners out of the market. Today's worsening affordability is particularly concerning given the stubbornly high disparities in homeownership rates for Black and Hispanic households. One notable feature of the trends in housing affordability over the last decades has been the spread of these problems to those higher up the income ladder. The recent jump in renter cost burdens has in fact been most pronounced among middle-income renters. A key driver of this trend has been a constrained supply of new homes, and particularly modest-priced homes and apartments, which has put upward pressure on both rents and home prices. Climbing interest rates further limited the supply of new single-family homes over the last decade, but over the last decade, multiple factors have been behind this lack of supply, including regulatory barriers to new development, rising costs of materials, and a lack of labor. Efforts to address these barriers to expand the supply of homes are needed to improve affordability. But the most severe affordability challenges continue to be concentrated among the nation's lowest income households who are outside the reach of the private market even under the best of circumstances, and so in need of greater public subsidies to close the gap between what they can afford and the cost of decent housing. But housing affordability is not the only challenge we face as a country. Housing policy has an important role to play in responding to the economic trajectories of neighborhoods, including where residents are at risk of displacement and communities that are suffering from disinvestment, where housing investments can be an important part of a revitalization strategy. Housing policies and supports are also needed to be attuned to our rapidly aging population, which presents a unique set of housing concerns. Finally, to maintain the quality of older, modest homes, to reduce energy consumption to meet our goals for carbon reduction, and to address the growing impact of severe weather events on homes, our nation's aging housing stock itself needs investment. I realize that I have outlined a broad set of challenges that are perhaps daunting, but having a good quality, affordable, and secure home in a thriving community is foundational for a healthy and productive life for every person in America. Addressing our housing challenges will take a substantial commitment from the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, but doing so would pay dividends for us all. Thank you for turning your attention to these critical issues and for your invitation to share this information today. I look forward to addressing any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Ober. Dr. Dietz, welcome.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Robert Dietz. I'm the Chief Economist of the National Association of Home Builders. NHB is proud to have the opportunity to testify before you today, and we applaud the committee for making housing the focus of its first hearing at the 118th Congress. I look forward to sharing our views on the state of housing and the barriers our industry faces to increasing the production of both for sale and for rent residences. The primary and persistent challenge of the residential market in 2023 is a lack of attainable, affordable housing in both the single-family and multifamily markets. And the fundamental cause of this challenge is a lack of construction over the prior decade that has resulted in a structural deficit of at least 1.5 million homes. The causes of this underbuilding are complex, but we commonly cite them as the 5 L's. It's a lack of labor, a lack of lots, lumber and building materials, lending for development and construction purposes, and of course, legal and regulatory burdens. Solving just one of these challenges is not enough. They must all be tackled. For example, the construction industry faces a persistent skilled labor shortage, with currently more than 400,000 open construction sector jobs needing to be filled. This will require the industry to recruit, train, and retain workers in the trades. The regulatory cost burden is large and distorts the market. NHB estimates that about a quarter of a typical newly built single-family home's purchase price is due to various kinds of regulatory costs. This burden can be even larger for apartment buildings due to delay costs and zoning issues. These growing regulatory burdens, such as exclusionary zoning practices, have made it very difficult to build entry-level housing for first-time homebuyers. And of course, everyone is aware of recent supply chain issues when lumber costs climbed and product and building material delays were common. Construction material costs have increased 36% since the start of 2020, ultimately resulting in higher rents and higher home prices. This is particularly true given the growing importance of new construction as a source of supply during a period when inventory of existing for-sale housing is low. NAR data, for example, shows that resale inventory stands at just a 2.9 month supply when 5 to 6 months would be balanced. These supply chain issues continue. In NAHB surveys, about half of single-family and multifamily builders cite ongoing delays with electrical transformers, as an example. To solve these fundamental challenges of the home building sector will be a significant undertaking, requiring policy action at all levels of government to address the limiting factors on the often neglected supply side of the housing sector. Safe, decent, and affordable housing provides fundamental benefits that are essential to the well-being of families, communities, and the nation. Having access to affordable rental housing is critical for younger households and working-class families, and homeownership is a primary source of household wealth for a typical family in the nation. For these reasons, NAHB has called on Congress and the administration to make housing affordability a top national policy priority. And the need is real. Nearly a third of renters were cost burdened in 2020, and reducing these burdens is going to require additional construction. Unfortunately, construction of new affordable rental housing is often impossible without some type of public support, such as the successful low-income housing tax credit or tax-exempt bond programs. And with homebuyers experiencing a doubling of the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage over the past year as the Federal Reserve fights inflation, single-family for-sale affordability has plummeted. According to the NHB Wells Fargo Housing Opportunity Index, just 38% of new and existing single-family homes are affordable to a typical family with median income of $90,000. This is the lowest affordability measure in the post-Great Recession period. Improving housing affordability for renters and home buyers will also help fight inflation. With these goals in mind, Congress should pass legislation that will help the home building industry increase much-needed housing supply, and helpful policy will focus on the supply-side challenges I've identified today. Addressing these supply-side bottlenecks would increase home construction, expand housing inventory, and lower inflation. If action on these issues is delayed, however, housing costs, which make up about 40% of the Consumer Price Index, will continue to be persistent drivers of inflation, as well as remain a burden on typical American families. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dietz. Mr. George, welcome to the committee.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, and members of the committee. Greetings and thank you for this opportunity to testify on the state of housing in rural America. My name is Lance George, and I'm the Director of Research and Information at the Housing Assistance Council. The Housing Assistance Council, often referred to by acronym HAC, is a national nonprofit corporation that supports affordable housing efforts in rural areas of the United States. HAC helps build homes and communities across rural America. We work with local community-based entities. These groups know what's best for their communities. We just help enable them to improve their housing conditions through an array of resources, including research, data, information to help inform strategies and solutions. In many respects, the housing issues, characteristics, and trends in rural America are no different than what Dr. Herbert or Dr. Dietz presented on national housing trends. But there are some unique differences in rural housing provisions and markets as well. Geography is important to this discussion. The people of rural America reside in approximately 1/4 of the United States' homes, but these homes are located across 97% of our nation's landmass. There's immense diversity across rural areas and small towns, yet there's also a set of community and market conditions that tie this landscape together. With this preface, we wish to quickly mention 5 trends in rural housing that we believe are of importance and interest to this committee. First, the pandemic left its mark on rural America, and housing markets remain uncertain. Housing instability is particularly concerning for rural renters. Throughout the pandemic, the Census Bureau's Pulse survey consistently revealed that renters nationally have been more likely to be behind on their house payments and have less confidence in their ability to make next month's rent than homeowners. Second, rural mortgage markets are being impacted by high interest rates and prices, too. Data from the Department of Agriculture on its guaranteed home loan product signals that rural home buyers hit the brakes as well. As a proxy for rural mortgage activity, USDA's loan guarantees plummeted by more than 40% from their 2021 levels. Number 3, affordability is the greatest housing challenge in rural America by far. Sometimes there is a misperception that housing affordability and costs are not as problematic in rural communities. But in reality, over 5.6 million, or 1/4 of rural households, are considered housing cost burden, and the incidence of cost burden has increased markedly for rural households over the past few decades. Number 4, manufactured housing is an often overlooked but important source of housing in rural America, especially in rural America. More than half of all manufactured homes are located in rural areas, and manufactured homes make up 13% of all houses in rural and small town communities, twice the national rate. Living in manufactured homes is often characterized by unique financing and land tenure dynamics. The majority of manufactured homes are financed with personal property or what's referred to as chattel loans. Approximately 66% of manufactured home loans are classified as high cost, meaning they have substantially high interest rates, which is more than 5 times the level of high cost lending for all homes nationally. And for manufactured homes secured by the home only, that is, without land, that figure jumps to a staggering 90% high cost loan rate. Number 5, race matters across the rural spectrum, especially in housing. Race and ethnicity are central but often complex components of our national history and struggles. One highly visible impact of race in rural America are areas of persistent poverty with substantial rates of non-white populations, including the lower Mississippi Delta and the rural Southeast, the border colonias along the U.S.-Mexico border, Native American lands, and among migrant and seasonal farm workers. In these largely rural communities and population, the incidence of substandard and inadequate homes is twice the national rate. Finally, I would only like to add that we simply don't know as much about rural housing conditions as we should. In the research realm, we often use the term bias. Well, as a rural researcher, I will present my own personal bias. The level of level and quality of data for rural communities is just not comparable to that of urban and suburban areas. The reasons are varied and the examples are many, but we would encourage the committee to promote greater rural data availability in resources like the census, the American Community Survey, and the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, among others. We need quality and accessible data to help inform strategies and solutions that improve housing for all communities, urban, suburban, and rural. HAC appreciates the committee's attention to housing issues in rural communities. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. George. The ranking member has a unanimous consent request, briefly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that Senator Lummis' statement be included in the record.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you. Start with Dr. Dietz and Dr. Herbert. We heard from the two of you and also from Mr. George that we need more housing supply across the board. Dr. Dietz, what are the types of housing where we see the greatest shortfall? You mentioned in your statement it's almost impossible to build affordable rental housing without a subsidy. What people are most likely to be priced out? And speak about that for a moment, if you would.
Yeah, when you talk to builders across the country and prospective home buyers, the tightest part of the housing market right now remains that small lot, entry-level construction that is appropriate for a first-time or a first-generation home buyer. So when you look at the data, more than 10 years ago, back in 2010, about 32% of new homes being built were under 2,400 square feet. That 32% share has now shrank to about 24%. So we've seen a marked decline in that entry-level construction. And then the impact, it is harder for those younger households to attain home ownership. So the result of that, of course, then is people renting longer, which is one of the reasons the rents are higher. And then we've had a near doubling of young adults who live with their parents over the last 20 years.
A doubling.
A doubling. It's gone from 1 in 10 25 to 34-year-olds to 1 in 5.
And that's over a 20-year period.
That's over a 20-year period. So these are longstanding issues.
Dr. Herbert, comment, if you would, on my question, your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I would agree with what Dr. Dietz said. I think the shortage of single family, particularly starter homes, is really important. He used the metric of 1,800 square feet. If we go down to 1,400 square feet, that was a very common home in the early 80s, and now it's low single digits. I was talking with a home builder, national home builder the other day, who specializes in this segment of the market, and they were saying there are communities that will mandate that the smallest house you can build is 1,600 square feet, so they can't even build their entry-level house in that market. So that restriction on building those starter homes is key. Dr. Dietz has also talked about the need for more townhomes and condos. That's a segment of the market that has really been missing, too, as an affordable entry point. And I would just also highlight the need for more modest-cost rental housing. What we've been building mostly over the last decade has been very large, prime location, multifamily housing downtown, which has been needed, but it's very hard to build at an affordable price point there. So it's really, we need to have lower density housing in the suburbs, but still making use of land that provides a kind of garden apartment style housing we used to build, more modest rental housing as well.
That comment you made about 1,600 and 1,400, I would, not in this hearing now, but I would like to explore that more with you, that it could answer some of these problems, I think. So pretty interesting comments. Dr. Herbert and Mr. George, you both talked about home repairs as a tool to help lower income homeowners and seniors. Talk about the benefits of home repairs, most importantly, what resources can make those repairs affordable for families with limited incomes. Start with you, Mr. George, then you, Dr. Dietz.
Thank you, Senator. I think home repairs are important, particularly to older population in the United States. And as you know, the population in rural America is just older than the nation as a whole, and is maybe a harbinger for things to come nationally. But oftentimes, older Americans need resources and the ability to repair their homes. And I think there are several resources that come to mind. One notably I would like to reinforce from the work that the Housing Assistance Council does is that capacity among local housing providers is extremely important. So they are oftentimes the local housing nonprofits are the connective tissue or the catalyst that help to turn these resources into affordable homes and supply those vital home repairs. So I think capacity at a local level is important. Also, I would just quickly mention USDA Section 504 Home Loan and Rehab Repair Program, which has assisted hundreds of thousands of rural homeowners across the United States and is particularly important to older homeowners. So Those are a couple of quick resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dietz. Your comments.
Yeah, the remodeling sector is absolutely critical as part of the reinvestment strategy. As Dr. Herbert mentioned, we've got an aging housing stock. The typical home in the United States right now is about 39 years old. About 15 years ago, it was kind of in the low 30s. That's a pretty dramatic increase in the period of time. So if we're looking to improve the housing stock, improve energy efficiency, improve resiliency, making sure that remodelers have access to skilled labor is going to be key. Remodelers like to say, not only do I have to find skilled workers, but they have to work in someone's home. So finding those additional workers is important. And I think policy tools can play a role. The Section 25C and 25D energy efficiency tax credits are good tools, but making sure that people can access cash out refi mortgages to get capital to reinvest in those homes. That's really where the low-hanging fruit is when it comes to improving our housing stock.
And Dr. Herbert, would you answer that question too? But I want to, just because time's limited, if you'd work in an answer to this question also. I've co-sponsored the Bipartisan Eviction Crisis Act with Senator Portman, my colleague who just retired from Ohio, Senator Young and Senator Bennett, offering ways to reduce the number and impact of evictions on the lives of families across the country. Matt Desmond has written about it. And so if you would also answer what lessons can we learn from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program as we continue to work to reduce evictions?
Thank you, Senator. Briefly on the remodeling question, I would echo what my colleagues have said and highlight the fact that we have an older housing stock. We also have housing that is in need of energy retrofits. And as you mentioned in your original question, an aging population that needs housing that's adapted to meet their needs with mobility and other ways to keep them safe. In terms of how, I would highlight the importance of grants, particularly for very low-income households who may not, particularly elderly households who may not have the ability to take on loans. And I would also highlight the need for technical assistance for people to be able to assess the need and help find a contractor and make sure the work is done well. In terms of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, I think it's really, the evidence is quite clear that the program was enormously helpful in keeping people, keeping renters in their homes, and at the same time also enormously helpful for landlords who were suffering from lost rental payments. More than 3 million renters have received assistance from that program. It's been remarkably well targeted. Some 2/3 of those assisted have been earned less than 30% of area median income. Another 20% earned between 30 and 50%. And what we saw during the pandemic, enormous concern that we were going to see evictions go through the roof. And what we found from the data from Eviction Lab in Princeton is that, in fact, evictions stayed very low, in part because we had a moratorium, but that emergency rental assistance was really critical in making sure that people could stay stably housed.
Thank you. Those comments are really important. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. George, your comments about the harbinger of things to come as it relates to the aging population, aging housing stock, and the needs going forward. I think we could have an entire hearing on the importance of aging in America. I think it's by the year 2040 or so, 1 out of 5 Americans will be over the age of 65. We've got real challenges coming in what we need. Would you agree to that?
I agree, Senator. Thank you.
And we have a lot of work to do on that topic. I'd also want to reflect on a little bit the importance of good government policy versus bad government policy. I think Dr. Thomas Sowell said it really well when he said that the goals of rent control and its actual consequences are at opposite policies. I think that's well said, and I oftentimes wonder if all of the great minds can use common sense when it comes to delivering reality. Does reality actually marry the comments? And Dr. Thomas Sowell's comments, I think, are best reflected in the Twin Cities, in St. Paul and Minneapolis. In St. Paul, Minnesota, we saw rent control go in, and when that happened, the census data showed that there was nearly an 80% drop in construction. Next door, Minneapolis did not follow in that suit, and we saw construction permits increase by nearly 70%. Stark example reinforcing the words of one of the greatest economists in my mind of all time. Despite the overwhelming evidence and wide consensus that rent control or rent stabilization depresses supply, exacerbates discrimination, reduces both quality and safety, and makes housing less affordable, amazingly, this administration has chosen to evaluate the feasibility of adopting such policies. Dr. Dietz, how are renters impacted by policies that forbid landlords, including mom and pop landlords, from setting rents at market rates?
Yeah, I think most economists would agree that rent control type policies basically act as a tax on supply in the long run. So they're counterproductive in the sense that the ultimate solution to all the challenges that we're talking about today is adding additional supply. So whether it's rent control or other harmful regulatory policies that show up at the local level, they drive production elsewhere. And what we've seen in the last 10 years is those communities that have been able to add affordable housing stock, whether it's for renters or for home buyers, they attract businesses, they attract jobs. I mean, Columbus, Ohio is a good example of that with the new Intel facility. So it's getting that regulatory burden, whether it's at the federal level or the state and local level, as low as possible so we can add the stock necessary to house that workforce housing.
Do wealthier households or poorer households end up struggling with the consequences of these bad policies, as I would describe them?
Yeah, I would echo some of the data that Dr. Herbert mentioned, which is that if you look at the housing cost burdens, whether for renters or home buyers, they tend to be concentrated among lower income individuals. And as we said earlier, if you talk about the housing that's most difficult to build, it's that smaller lot, slightly more dense, walkable type housing that's appropriate for renters or first-time home buyers. And that's where the regulatory burden emerges the hardest, and it's the kind of housing that's most difficult to build.
The chairman and I both really, when we heard the 1,600 square feet, we both said, wow, and 1,200 is darn near as bad. My mother's first house that I talked about earlier was 1,082 square feet. And so if that's not even possible in some areas, it's just ridiculous. The prices of housing per square foot now has never been higher. If you have to have a minimum square footage to build a house, you're talking to first-time home buyers, and you're just saying, please don't bother thinking about being a part of the American dream. Offensive from my perspective. Dr. Deese, you also mentioned exclusionary zones. Talk to me for a minute about that.
Yeah, so exclusionary zoning are policies I think economists of the left and the right both agree are inefficient. That's things like minimum lot size requirements. Yep. They basically say, okay, if you want to build that 1,400 square foot house, it's got to be built on a half acre or larger lot. In fact, if you look at the data for New England, the typical lot size of a newly built home is 0.9 acres. It's almost a full acre. Well, you can't build entry-level housing if you've got those kinds of zoning rules. So whether it's zoning rules or federal regulatory policies, what it's done is made it much more difficult for those first-time home buyers to attain home ownership.
I'm running out of time, which is something you have to get used to, Mr. Chairman. But I'll just say this, as a guy who used to run a county, chairman of Charleston County government, many of the issues that we're grappling with here in Washington really are local issues. And one of the reasons why I asked you about exclusionary zoning is because it is uniquely and specifically a local issue that many parts of the country face. The truth is, though, that we need to be able to bifurcate our responsibilities versus somebody else's. Perhaps we can send smoke signals, but the truth of the matter is some things need to be challenged on the local level and not here in Washington.
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me congratulate the new ranking member on his new position.
Take your time.
If the chairman lets me, I will. And thrilled to also now have him as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which I just came from. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. Flooding is one of the most expensive and most frequent natural disasters in the United States. Despite this, just 4% of Americans have flood insurance. With climate change bringing heavier rainfall, stronger hurricanes, we need to ensure that flood insurance remains affordable and homeowners are financially protected. But last year, FEMA implemented a new premium methodology for the National Flood Insurance Program that will lead to higher premiums. The agency itself has estimated that premium increases will cause 1 million policyholders to drop coverage and therefore dilute this already small pool. And to make matters worse, there is little transparency about how FEMA is pricing the premiums, leaving the construction industry in the dark about how to optimally build flood-resistant homes. So, Dr. Deese, how have home builders been impacted by FEMA's new premium system, and what would be the long-term effects for coastal communities if flood insurance becomes too expensive?
Yeah, thank you for raising this issue, Senator. This is something you hear about from builders across the country in terms of not just the direct effect in terms of home buyers and their costs of higher insurance premiums, and clearly flood insurance is an important part of making sure that we can build housing in areas where you've got job creation and economic activity. But it's the uncertainty of how those premiums are calculated as a data person that's particularly concerning. How can you plan to do land development in an environment where that calculation is not known? In other words, the underlying equations. That makes it difficult to do land development. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that if you're talking about home building, that process is preceded by 3 to 5, in some cases 10 years of land development. So that the uncertainty of it harms the land development process, which then harms the lot supply process, and then results in what we've talked about today, which is pricing out home buyers from the market, and it makes home ownership more expensive.
Yeah, and I would just note, if FEMA itself recognizes that it's going to lose 1 million policyholders, and insurance is about spreading risk across the widest base possible, you lose 1 million policyholders, that means the rates go up for everybody else. And then we have natural disasters in our states across the country, and the federal government comes and helps. Instead of having an insurance program that can mitigate as well as cover the costs, it doesn't make any sense to me. So that's why Senator Kennedy and I have introduced bipartisan legislation that will reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program, keep premiums affordable, invest in cost-saving mitigation measures to put the program on a firm financial footing. And I look forward to working with the chairman and the ranking member on this critical issue. I am concerned about two things, as someone who's sat on this committee for quite some time. Affordable housing is increasingly located in areas that are away from job centers, forcing workers to pay higher transportation costs or work fewer hours. Thankfully, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passed the last Congress, injected a much-needed $550 billion into reviving our nation's transportation systems. So, Dr. Herbert, how can we leverage the investments of IAGA to help connect affordable housing to good jobs? And how critical is it that we build more affordable housing near public transit so that we can connect people to good-paying jobs and careers?
Thank you for that question, Senator. It's absolutely critical that we have well-located housing near to transportation systems. I believe in his opening remarks, Chairman Brown mentioned the importance of housing and transportation. We talk about not just a housing cost burden, but you have to add transportation costs, which come with that house, to the housing cost to understand how much people are burdened. So well-located housing can address housing affordability by reducing that overall burden. In terms of the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act, my center recently did an analysis looking at the opportunities there to link that to housing. There's 3 ways. Much of that money is actually by formula, so it makes it difficult. But one is to provide technical assistance to state and localities to understand those connections. The second is to take advantage of the competitive grant programs to instill in those elements that require localities to get those grants to take into account housing. And then the third is to use for all the formula grant programs to try to build into those using existing tools, maybe through best practices and the like, to make sure that states and localities understand how those investments can help.
Finally, the Urban Institute says that 16.1 million new household formations over the next 20 years, 80% of them will be senior households. Now, it seems to me that this increase in senior households is going to put a huge demand on senior public and assisted housing capacity and needs for the next Congress to consider. Do you see it that way as well?
Absolutely, Senator. In my written testimony, I talked about the increasing number of senior renters with worst-case housing needs. Since 2011, the baby boom generation started turning 65, and over that same last decade period, we've seen a 60% growth in senior renters who are either paying 50% of their housing or their income for housing or living in severely inadequate housing. And this is in many respects the tip of the iceberg as that older population, particularly people old 75 and older, where the baby boom edge is just now, will continue to grow over time. So we're absolutely going to see an enormous increase in need among our most oldest residents.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Menendez. Senator Vance, one of our new members from my state of Ohio, is recognized. Welcome.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I guess since there's no Republicans between me and you, that makes me the ranking member here. Is that I'm drunk with power for the next 5 minutes here.
Keep thinking
Thank you
that way
for
about
having
this
me.
place.
I wanted to direct my first question to Mr. George, and one of the things I've seen reported on lately is the idea, and we've certainly seen evidence of this in the data, that you have this massive influx from more progressive states into typically red states, sometimes very rural, from a very affluent portion of the home buyer population. What have you seen? I mean, and I'm talking places like Florida, Montana, Idaho, Utah, and so forth. What effects are we seeing on housing prices from this influx of a pretty affluent group of home buyers? Is housing supply keeping up, and if not, why?
Thank you, Senator Vance, for that question. I agree. We are seeing this. It's hard to parse out in the data because it's still a relatively new phenomenon. There's no doubt that there was what we would call, and I'm not a demographer, but there was population churn as a result of the pandemic. And it, according to some of our analyses and mortgage analysis and various other housing data analysis, it does appear as if much of that population growth is in areas of high amenities or in relatively close proximity to large metropolitan areas. What we hear, again, we're trying to see in the data, and we've seen this some in mortgage prices, but is an acute shortage of rental housing in many of these communities. In general, many rural communities lack a good source of or a good stock of affordable rental housing. And when you have that relatively small stock, much of that is being, for lack of a better term, gobbled up or purchased up in many rural communities. And it's, it's particularly causing affordability or housing affordability challenges among rural renters.
Great, thank you. Mr. Dietz, I want to direct this one to you. So this actually, staff brought this to my attention. I wasn't aware of this, but if you look both at the United States, but also a lot of other OECD countries, you see this really stark decline in productivity of construction workers going back to the 1970s. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's driving that. I mean, we sort of think of all of the innovations in technology, but somehow we're less productive as a society than we were half a century ago. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, some of it could be a data issue. We're not measuring the remodeling sector correctly. But I think if we think about the economics, the challenge here is that the regulatory cost burden has grown during that period of time. So when we're talking about productivity, we're talking about output per worker, literally the number of homes and apartments we build per construction worker. And it's a real challenge. It's both an impact of the labor shortage itself, but it does point to some opportunities. If we can get the regulatory burdens down, I think we can see a great deal of innovation in the home building sector, things like off-site construction, more capitalization of the work site, smarter products, and all those represent real market opportunities for the industry.
Yeah, I mean, it occurs to me that we all agree and think it's important to have basic public safety for both the construction workers, but also the things that they build. But if productivity has declined or stagnated for 50 years, that of course means a lot of our construction workers are not earning the wages they should be earning. It also means a lot of the homes that we're building maybe are not as high quality as they should be. I want to just sort of finish with one observation here. And this is obviously a focus, the immigration crisis that we have in this country is a focus of especially this side of the aisle, the conservatives. It's something that we talk a lot about. But I want to make this observation because I think very often we talk about the immigration problem, certainly in the state of Ohio for very good reasons, as a fentanyl problem. Obviously that affects the housing stock and the housing situation a little bit. But it's mostly a human problem, just the basic misery and the death and destruction caused by it. We talk about it as a law and order problem. But I want to plant the seed both for our colleagues on my side of the aisle, colleagues elsewhere, and also for those of you who are interested in this issue, that if you think about what it means to have 20 or 25 million undocumented illegal immigrants in a country in a situation where we're not building enough housing, that puts incredible pressure. You have way more buyers for way fewer homes, and that puts incredible pressure on home buyers and people who just want to live a good life. I'm a very strong believer that we should think about our immigration problem and our immigration crisis as an economic problem as much as a cultural or law and order problem. Immigration in this country right now, illegal immigration in this country means wage theft in the form of competition for jobs from lower wage, migrants. And in this instance, in the context of housing, illegal immigration means theft of the American dream of housing when you have 25 million people who shouldn't be here by law competing with American citizens to buy their first home, to rent a home. And that is a major problem that we should be talking more about in the context of the immigration crisis. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Vance. Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me also welcome our new members as well. I want I'm not going to ask a question on my first comment. This is much to share. I would like to share with all of you. We'll send you some materials and from my colleagues. I mean, lots of indications about the racial wealth gap in this country, particularly between black households and white households. Last Congress, we had I think, a relatively innovative approach that said, let's look at first-generation, first-time home buyers. By definition, that's about 60% roughly people of color. And if you qualify for that traditional 30-year mortgage and you fit into this category, you'd have to start at a relatively small basis. Rather than giving you a 30-year mortgage, we'll give you a 20-year mortgage and the payment schedule will be based on 30. So it's a indirect subsidy. But what it does for that first-time home buyer is it literally allows them to accumulate equity at almost twice the rate, just the plain math at a 10-year basis. And I think as we think about wealth gap, creating that equity in an attainable manner is, I think, at least part of the solution, number one. Number two, and I want to get a quick response, I've got a third question, or third point I want to make is, I'm a big advocate around tax credits along the supply side. I think everyone you've all mentioned, we have really a huge supply issue, particularly for affordable housing, low and moderate income housing. So I've supported, LIHTC, new market tax credits. Actually, Senator Portman and Senator Cardin had a really interesting initiative, new neighborhood homes investment tax credit. How do you go at that housing stock that in distressed communities, and we've got them all, every one of us have got some of those, and that could rebuild that structure or fix it up to code. In many cases, the equity may not be enough to refurbish that building. But what can we do along the tax credit range to take these or other initiatives and really target it to those communities most in need? And I'd ask relatively brief responses, so we'll go down the line.
Senator, I would second that endorsement for the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act that would close the gap between what it costs to build housing and the market rate. And it's necessary to prime the pump in these areas where demand has fallen. So I think that's an incredibly important use, both for rehab and new construction. So I would just second that.
Yeah, consider expansion and refinement of the low-income housing tax credit. It is the most successful production program for improving rental affordability. On the homeownership side, consider taking the now modified mortgage interest deduction after the 2017 Tax Reform Act and converting it into a broad-based homeownership credit that can be claimed whether you're an itemizer or not. That would help on the homeownership side.
Interesting suggestion.
Thank you, Senator. As we noted in our testimony, there's a dearth of good quality rental housing in many rural communities, so production at any level, the tax credit is one of the largest rental production programs in the United States. It doesn't work as well in some rural communities for various reasons. I'm not an expert on that, but I would just say we need production in rural America of any scope. Thank you.
And I strongly support all three of these. And Mr. Chairman, I tell you, I think there's a number of our colleagues on the Republican side that are interested on this supply issue around the tax credit, and I'd welcome folks like our new colleague to join in that discussion. One of the things that a lot of folks from the traditional civil rights community have always advocated for as well is down payment assistance. I'm not sure that's going to take place for the current makeup in the House. So one of the things I've been trying to explore, and again, I'll throw it out, would like your quick responses, but if we could get a longer response, is and as we think about how we keep healthcare workers in rural communities, for example, I'm interested in the idea of giving an appropriate incentive for an employer to provide a tax-assisted down payment assistance that might, to that employee, come in on a tax-free basis. Help with that down payment, help retain that workforce. Have any of you done any work around employer-based tax credits in terms of down payment assistance?
Senator, I have not, although I have certainly heard of employers who are struggling to get employees into their markets. Most of the initiatives I've heard have been focused on the rental side, but I think that adapting this for the home ownership side would have a lot of benefits as well. So I think employers have a need and an incentive to participate.
And our research has tended to focus more on the supply side, but where employers get involved in the housing market is making sure that builders in those markets can construct and add supply to the marketplace because they know they don't want to expand to markets where housing's not available.
Thank you, Senator. I would only agree with the other two commenters and also note that we hear anecdotally to some degree that businesses that want to move into rural communities don't have a good supply of housing across the spectrum for low, moderate, and
But if
higher
we could
income.
combine that supply with some of our existing tools, but also with some level of down payment assistance, you've got a great retention tool. You have a benefit to workers in distressed communities. And I'm going to do some work on this, Mr. Chairman, and would love to work with you and others on both sides of the aisle to explore this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. The lady from Alabama, Senator Brett, for her first hearing is recognized.
Absolutely. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you and the ranking member for your warm welcome today at my very first hearing. It is certainly an honor to be on this committee, and I look forward to being a very productive and active part of it. So thank you. So my first question is for Mr. Dietz or Dr. Dietz. We know the Biden administration has actually put in more rules and regulations in the first 2 years of their administration than Obama did in 8. When we look at that, it undoubtedly contributes to inflation and to stifled economic growth across the board, and I believe the housing sector is no exception to that. I understand the regulations add cost to building homes, 25% of the cost of constructing a single-family home and 40% of a multi-family home due to regulations. So I know that you face regulations both at a state and a local level, and I wanted to know if you could share some of those existing regulations that are really driving up cost for home buyers.
Yeah, I think a good example at the federal level is the Waters of the U.S. rule, which is both confusing but adds costs, makes it difficult to bring land to market, takes longer, provides a lot of money for consultants to do studies, but provides that uncertainty during the land development process that can take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. At the local level, we already talked about zoning rules, but you also have rising impact fees, delay requirements. Just the delay itself of getting land approved, construction projects approved, all of that results in higher rents and higher home prices. So if we're really serious about tackling housing affordability, we need to find ways to reduce the red tape and bring homes to market faster.
Absolutely. Well, given those hurdles, can you tell me, is it harder, single-family homes, multifamily homes, who have been impacted more by this ultimately?
Well, if you listen to builders enough, which I do, I travel across the country a lot, they will say all of us, right? It's not necessarily a competition. They're all sort of challenging in their own ways. Multifamily, it's more density issues. With single family, it's concerns about land supply and lot development. With remodeling, it's the skilled labor shortage. But if we're looking at low-hanging fruit to improve the availability of housing in the country, reducing housing regulatory costs is a big way to get there.
And you're saying home buyers across the board are impacted?
Yeah, I probably disproportionately affects first-time buyers, first-generation buyers, because again, that entry-level construction, that townhouse construction is difficult too. That sort of light-touch density, but generally speaking, it is driving up the cost of all forms of housing.
So it's people that want to start the American dream that are being stifled by this. So the past 2 years, inflationary policies of the Biden administration have compounded the naive belief that the inflation would be transitory. We've seen it hit us everything from groceries to gas, and obviously home buying is no exception to that. The past year alone, the Federal Reserve has raised the Federal Reserve fund rates nearly 5 percentage points, and that's materially impacted the price of housing, driving up borrowing cost and monthly mortgage cost to the average American home buyer. What is your outlook of the housing demand, and how does that impact the expected housing construction in the next, I'd say, what do we see in the next 2 years, maybe 5 years, 10 years?
Yeah, right now we're in a bit of a downturn, as Dr. Herbert talked about. Our expectation is that single-family construction and multifamily construction are likely to decline this year. But we see a turning point ahead for single-family home building. In fact, after 12 straight months of decline for builder sentiment that we measure each month, we actually got an uptick in January. So I think in the short run, we're going to see some stabilization. And then 2025 through 2030, if we can just get the regulatory burdens out of the way, 2025 through 2030 will be a pretty good runway for home building growth, because we've got to reduce that structural housing deficit that's in place, that shortage.
Absolutely. And as we talk, obviously, about the home building, I think it's important to make sure that people can can get access to capital, that they can be financed. Is there anything you can tell us about the status of the loan market or anything that the committee needs to consider to make sure that capital is available for these people who want to achieve the American dream?
Yeah, this is where we don't see enough focus. I think when we talk about lending and loans in housing, we're typically thinking about mortgages on the demand side. But keep in mind about 2/3 of home construction is undertaken by smaller builders, and they get their capital by going to community banks and borrowing funds. So we call that acquisition, development, and construction lending. And one of the things we know about the business cycle is that particular market tightens when we go into a downturn. So the concern is we see mortgage interest rates begin to settle back, a turning point comes in view, but builders and land developers can't get access to credit. So there's a lot of different ideas in terms of how to address some of those challenges. One would be extending the secondary market that currently exists for purchase mortgages over to builder and construction loans, and that would help reduce some of the cost of credit and make sure that capital is available, particularly in, I would say, like rural markets where it's more difficult to obtain that kind of lending for builders.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Dietz.
Thank you, Senator Brett. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized from her office, I believe.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. We know that housing is the largest expense for American families every month, and the problem has just gotten worse. New research shows that for the first time, the typical American renter is spending at least 30% of their income to cover the average rent. That makes them rent burdened by federal standards. Now, a severe shortage of homes paired with growing persistence of greedy corporate landlords has made this problem worse and put housing out of reach for many families. Fixing this problem at its root is going to require serious investments in building more housing, like those I call for in my American Housing and Economic Mobility Act. And I'm going to keep fighting for this. But the problems that renters face go far beyond the supply problem. In too many places across the country, renters have few protections from needless evictions, excessive fees, and exorbitant rent hikes. Dr. Herbert, you're one of the nation's leading researchers on the housing market, so let me ask you, there's been a growing movement of tenants across the country calling on the federal government to establish tenant protection standards. Why is it important that the federal government act to protect tenants?
Thank you, Senator. Well, I would say that there's lessons that we've learned from the previous pandemic about the importance of housing and having stable, secure housing, which led us to take steps nationally to have an eviction moratorium and the like. I think there's a lesson there that says this is an issue of national interest. It should be something that differs depending on what state you're in. The other precedent I would point to is in the mortgage market, where we have a number of federal statutes, RESPA, TILA, ACOA, that all relate to making sure that home buyers across the country, wherever you live, are treated fairly in the market. So I think there's very similar parallel there between homeowners and renters.
Yeah, that is a really important point. And it's part of the reason that I led a letter with Congressman Jamal Bowman, joined by 47 of our colleagues, calling on President Biden to take executive action to protect tenants and bring down rental costs. 2 weeks ago, the White House announced a framework for enhanced renter protections, and I was glad to see this action. It's an important first step, but we need more. In fact, the day the White House's framework was announced, the real estate lobby celebrated, and they bragged that they had watered down the administration's announcement. This is the very same industry that spent over $100 million on lobbying last year, including to fight against renter protections. And at the National Apartment Association, the organization that lobbies on behalf of corporate landlords, said, quote, "What we can say with certainty about the Biden administration's blueprint for advancing a renter's Bill of Rights is that NAA's advocacy helped avert an executive order." Now, Dr. Herbert, what does it tell you that the landlord lobby is celebrating an announcement that was purported to be about protecting tenants?
Well, Senator, what I would say is that in a market where, as you said in your opening remarks, half of renters are cost burdened, more than a quarter are severely burdened. We saw rents rising in high double digits, and on top of this pain, I guess I would just urge the apartment industry and the industry, housing industry, to take some ownership of the question of what do we do and how do we protect renters. Obviously, we want investors and owners of properties to make a reasonable return, but it can't come at the expense of people being forced out on the streets.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And look, if the big corporate landlords see this blueprint as cause for celebration, then I think it is probably safe to assume there's a lot more that the administration could do to meaningfully protect renters. You know, in fact, they can start by making sure that the federal government isn't in the business of subsidizing law-breaking corporate landlords. A U.S. House Subcommittee investigation found that 4 corporate landlords evicted nearly 15,000 families during the COVID eviction moratorium. Some of these landlords received federal financing to help them buy up housing on the cheap. I think that's fundamentally wrong, and that anyone that's breaking the law should not be permitted to participate in these federal programs. So I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here. Thank you, Dr. Herbert. The administration has an obligation to ensure that agencies are using all of their authorities to protect families' access to housing. And where the agencies lack the tools to forcefully protect renters, then I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass legislation to get them the tools that they need. It's going to take an all-of-government approach to bring down housing costs for American families, and it's time for us to get to work on this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Van Hollen of Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you for being here and for your testimony. Dr. Herbert, I have a number of questions for you relating to housing vouchers, because I agree with the strong sentiment that we have to get at the supply issue. Obviously, that's fundamental to making sure that we have more affordable housing. And I look forward to working with everybody here on creative solutions to that. But while we need to start that right away, it doesn't address the issue right away. And we do need more, in my view, affordable housing vouchers. I know you've testified about this in the past and written about it in the past. I've introduced legislation over the years that we're going to continue to push for. It's a bipartisan bill. It's called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. It really does 2 things. Number one, it would provide more affordable housing vouchers, period. So more people would have access to affordable housing. But the opportunity part of the bill is important. It is focused on families with young kids, along with mobility services, to really provide opportunities for more upward mobility, as the name indicates. Could you talk a little bit about the need for additional housing vouchers and how they can also be used to achieve a greater opportunity for families?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. I would say we absolutely need more subsidies, and I think we need to have a balance of subsidies. We talk a lot about today about supply, but you're right. Housing vouchers are more immediate, and they also address issues around access to a broader range of communities. And thinking about different market conditions and places where we have a tight supply, vouchers may be challenging to use, but other places we have plenty of housing. And as your bill points to, I think there's both a need for more vouchers but more supports. There was a study done by Opportunity Insights in conjunction with King County in Washington State, where they provided counseling to voucher holders to open up their range of information they had about communities. And they found an enormous increase in people coming from urban areas to looking and considering moving to higher opportunities areas. That counseling helped, that information helped, support for moving costs helps, and also engagement with landlords. It's important to have landlords who understand the program and are willing to engage to it. So I think if we're really going to make vouchers work, to have this ability to move to opportunity, we have to provide information and supports to make it happen.
No, I appreciate that. And as you indicated, as I said as well, this is a bipartisan initiative because it accomplishes those twin goals. Can you talk about the challenges that we continue to face where there are some homeowners that discriminate against those who are using vouchers. Obviously, if we're going to, work to try to make sure that there are more opportunities here, we need to make sure that that people aren't discriminating against those who are using a voucher as part of their rent payment.
Yes, Senator. And, in a number of states, they have passed so-called source of income discrimination laws, which make it against the law to be able to say, I refuse to rent to you because of how your rent is going to be paid. But in many states, those protections don't exist. Landlords in those cases may decide they won't rent to Section 8 vouchers, effectively closing off a whole range of the housing stock to those folks. So expanding those protections are a really important part of making sure the voucher program can be used. And I will say that there are ways in which the program can be challenging for landlords. So I would have a carrots and stick approach, where if you're going to do that, it also would make sure that you're addressing the concerns landlords have about quality inspections and the like. Doing both is important, but certainly starting with don't discriminate is an important first step.
Could you talk? I'm happy to look at both, a requirement that people not discriminate based on source of income, but also what are some of the carrots that you think that need to be applied?
Well, I think help with the property inspections and making sure that those aren't, there's a whole set of quality standards that can be, somewhat inconsequential. Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, talked about an inspector looking for a shower curtain as a step. So I think making sure that that process is not unduly cumbersome for the landlords and the like. So I think it's really a question of looking at it also from the landlord's perspective to say, how can we make this process simpler and less fraught for them?
Got it. Do either of the other witnesses have any comments on this? Dr. Dietz?
I would just issue a bit of caution. NHB has been supportive of voucher programs. We think they're important, but a voluntary participation in the program is better. Keep in mind, for typical multifamily owner-operator, they tend to be smaller businesses. So as you layer additional regulatory requirements on, it does increase the cost of housing and therefore deters investment in the multifamily sector.
Right. Just a quick follow-up, but just so I understand you agree that we should have a principle of non-discrimination by landlords based on the source of income of the tenant. Do you agree with that principle?
In principle, but not in terms of requirements of rules. And the complexity of it is particularly difficult for owner-operators.
No, I think this is, as I understand Dr. Herbert's point, in terms of more incentives. The idea would be to address, we agree on the principle?
Sure.
But understanding that there could be additional administrative burdens that someone has to go through. If we're addressing that issue, I'm assuming that you would support enforcing the principle.
Our preference on incentives would be to expand the low-income housing tax credit program because that increases supply.
Well, no, as I said at the outset, I strongly support that and would like to see an expansion of that as well on the supply side. But we also have to address this immediate issue. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Scott and I each have one question, one more question, then we'll wrap up. Mine's to Mr. George. HAC found that affordable rental units developed under USDA's 515 program have been exiting the program when their loans mature at a faster rate than predicted. In the coming years, 515 buildings that are home to thousands of families and seniors may be eligible to leave the program. What would the consequences be for rural renters in states like mine, where there are a number of them, if we just let these affordable 515 units exit the program? What do we do then to preserve affordable housing?
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Just to go back into the larger discussion we had on the importance of rental housing, but a dearth of good quality rental housing in many rural communities. And this particular source of rental housing, if you go into a community, it's oftentimes among the best rental housing in a rural community. But the impacts can be profound and they can be multiplying. The first of which, at a degree, which I don't think Congress would enact, if you let every unit expire, you would lose somewhere between 350 and 400,000 vital, affordable rental units in rural communities. The second element I would note is the tenants in these properties tend to be among the most vulnerable in the United States. 2/3 of the tenant occupancy are elderly or disabled, and they have an average household income of just above $13,000. And in many respects, there would be no place for them to go. That would be the final point. That there are just not a lot of other good options. This is not, again, these are not tenants that are in the workforce. They're not highly mobile, and it would be very difficult for them to find affordable housing in many of these communities without this particular resource. It's just a very valuable resource in rural communities.
Thank you. Exactly what we thought and hoped you would say thank you. And I have been into these communities and know how vulnerable rural Ohio has become with the change in the economy. So thank you. Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thinking about housing affordability throughout South Carolina, I know that when you travel to my family's hometown of Sally, South Carolina, that you see perhaps more manufactured homes or mobile homes or modular homes. The theory that modular or manufactured homes are of less quality and not as safe is consistently proven not true. I would love for us to one day visit the Innovating Housing Showcase put on by HUD at the National Mall, where home builders and manufactured housing industry have an opportunity to demonstrate the innovations in home construction. My question, Dr. Dietz, is it seems that both manufactured and modular housing show great promise in terms of constructing decent, safe, quality housing that low-income families can afford. What are the threats to more of these housing opportunities being procured by modest family?
Yeah, there's a real potential here for off-site construction. So particularly in home building, that's modular and panelized construction. It's only about 3% of single-family starts. In the late 90s, it was 8%. So just getting back to the market share we talked about labor productivity in the sector. This is a way to do it. But like any innovation in any business sector, it's about rate of return, making sure the capital is available, and then making sure the regulatory environment is not so harsh that you can't make those investments and then reap that investment return. So we do think that's one area where you're going to see innovation in housing and will help housing affordability in the long run.
Any comments, Dr. George?
No, only to reiterate that this is an extremely important source of housing in rural communities, but it's often maligned and overlooked. I would agree completely, especially since the construction of what we call commonly the HUD code in 1976. The quality, safety, size, amenities of these homes are indistinguishable from stick-built homes. What we do see in some respects are sometimes consumers have a foot in both worlds, where the quality of the homes are very high, but elements about how the home is sold, financed, praised, or warranted are oftentimes in the automobile realm, and sometimes consumers aren't as well served by those elements. And we're trying to make I think it's would be laudable to try to make, particularly home financing, to provide consumers of this product similar financing options that conventional or stick-built home owners with mortgages.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Scott. Thanks to the witnesses today for being here and providing testimony. We chose the state of housing because that is, to me, the #1 priority on this committee. So thank you for your leadership and for speaking out. Senators who wish to submit questions, for the record, they're due 1 week from today, Thursday, February 16th, to the witnesses. You have 45 days to respond to any questions. Thank you again. Any closing comment?
Thank you, Jeremy. I think we had a very good hearing today, talking about the challenges and the burdens that government can put on the home building business. And frankly, if you have more burdens on the business of building homes, you have more burdens on the ability to achieve the American dream, which for most of us is home ownership. I appreciate the consensus approach to this committee. I'm sure we're going to have that on every single hearing we have this year. I'll wait for a response.
Yes, Senator Scott.
Thank you so much,
We
sir.
will attempt to.
Yes, sir. Appreciate that.
Thank you. That the hearing's adjourned. Thanks, folks.